Eric thought his life was perfect: a loving wife, a beautiful daughter, and a promising career. But everything changed when he discovered his wife, Jenna, was cheating, shattering the foundation of their marriage. As Eric navigates the fallout, including a bitter custody battle and Jenna's desperate attempts to reconcile, he struggles to rebuild his life for the sake of his daughter, Sophie. Just as he begins to find balance, unexpected twists and emotional confrontations threaten to derail his progress. Will Eric find the strength to overcome the betrayal and create a new future, or will the past pull him back? Life in 2007 was different. Smartphones were just gaining traction, social media hadn't yet consumed our lives, and people spent their time in coffee shops or parks instead of glued to screens. That year, in a quaint town just outside Chicago, my life seemed picture perfect. Eric and Jenna had been married for 8 years. They were high school sweethearts who somehow defied the odds, getting married right after college and building a life together. Eric was steady, predictable, and maybe even a little boring, a quality Jenna used to find comforting. He worked as an architect, spending long hours perfecting designs, while Jenna had a knack for turning their house into a home. They lived in a charming 2-story house with white shutters and a wraparound porch. Inside, it was always warm, filled with the smell of baked goods or freshly brewed coffee. Their 6-year-old daughter, Sophie, was the glue that held them together. She had her mother's dimples and her father's serious eyes, a reminder of their shared history and the dreams they once had. Eric loved Jenna deeply. To him, she was his anchor, the one person who understood him better than anyone else. But life had a way of creeping in, turning their passionate love into something more practical and routine. Between work, Sophie's endless school activities, and Jenna's part-time job at a local boutique, their once vivid connection had faded. Jenna had always been the life of the party, the type of person who could light up a room with her laughter. Over the years, though, Eric had noticed her smile didn't reach her eyes as often. She'd started spending more time with her friends. Book club meetings that seemed to stretch late into the night or yoga classes she'd never mentioned before. At first, Eric didn't question it. After all, wasn't this what marriage was? Two people balancing their own lives while still trying to meet in the middle. The cracks began to show one rainy Thursday evening. Eric had come home late from work, drenched and exhausted, only to find the house unusually quiet. Sophie was asleep, her school bag still unpacked by the door. Eric called out for Jenna, but got no response. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and her phone went straight to voicemail. He told himself not to overthink it. She was probably out with her friends again. Still, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. When Jenna finally came home, it was after midnight. She was wearing a dress Eric didn't recognize, and her hair smelled faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers. He didn't ask her where she'd been. He wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The next morning, things felt strained. Jenna was unusually chipper, humming as she poured Sophie's cereal. But Eric couldn't shake the unease from the night before. When she leaned in to kiss him goodbye, he turned his cheek, pretending to be distracted by an email on his phone. Days turned into weeks, and Eric's suspicions grew. Jenna's nights out became more frequent, and her excuses less convincing. She was vague about where she was going and who she was with, brushing off Eric's questions with a laugh or a change of subject. Sophie, perceptive as always, began asking why Mommy wasn't home for bedtime stories anymore. Eric didn't have an answer. One evening, Eric's friend Mark stopped by unannounced. Mark had been Eric's best friend since college, a straight shooter who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Over a couple of beers, Mark mentioned something that made Eric's heart drop. "You know, I saw Jenna downtown last weekend," Mark said casually, taking a sip of his drink. "She was with some guy I didn't want to assume anything, but it didn't look like just friends." Eric felt his stomach twist. He managed to nod, forcing a laugh. Probably a coworker or something. You know how she is, always meeting new people. Mark hesitated, studying Eric's face. Yeah, maybe, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. That night, Eric couldn't sleep. Mark's words replayed in his mind, feeding into every doubt and insecurity he'd been pushing down. He got out of bed, careful not to wake Jenna, and went downstairs to the kitchen. He sat at the table, staring at his hands, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. The following weekend, Eric decided to confront Jenna. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to accuse her outright, but needing to understand what was going on. When she came home from another late night, he was waiting for her in the living room. Jenna, he began, his voice steady but firm. We need to talk. She looked at him, her smile faltering. Can it wait until tomorrow? I'm exhausted. No, he said, standing up. It can't. There was a long silence as they stared at each other. Jenna crossed her arms, her posture defensive. What's this about, Eric? He took a deep breath. I feel like I don't know you anymore. You're always out. You're distant. And Mark saw you last weekend with someone. Jenna's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Mark doesn't know what he's talking about. I was meeting a client. At midnight, in a dress like that? Eric's voice cracked, betraying the hurt he'd been holding back. Jenna sighed, rubbing her temples. You're being paranoid. I can't believe you're listening to Mark over me. It's not just Mark, Eric said, his frustration boiling over. It's everything. The late nights, the excuses, the way you've been acting, Jenna. If there's something going on, just tell me. Her silence spoke volumes. She opened her mouth to say something, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned and walked upstairs, leaving Eric alone in the dimly lit living room. The confrontation changed something between them. Jenna became more guarded, and Eric more distant. They spoke less, and when they did, it was only about Sophie or the mundane logistics of daily life. It felt like they were living as strangers under the same roof. One evening, Eric decided to follow Jenna. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't take the not knowing any longer. She told him she was going to a book club meeting, but when she left the house, she drove in the opposite direction of where the club usually met. Eric tailed her car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He felt like a character in one of the crime dramas he and Jenna used to watch together, except this was his life, and he didn't want to know the ending. When Jenna pulled into the parking lot of a hotel, Eric's heart sank. He parked a few spaces away, watching as she got out of the car and greeted a man waiting by the entrance. They hugged, and Eric saw the way Jenna looked at him, like she used to look at Eric. He didn't confront her that night. Instead, he drove home, numb. The weight of what he'd seen pressed down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud. Admitting it would make it real. The next morning, Jenna acted as if nothing had happened. She kissed Sophie on the forehead before heading out the door, leaving Eric to get their daughter ready for school. As he brushed Sophie's hair, she looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. Daddy, are you and Mommy mad at each other? Eric's throat tightened. No, sweetheart, he said softly. Everything's fine. But it wasn't fine. And deep down, Eric knew things would never be the same again. Eric spent the next few days going through the motions. Work, picking Sophie up from school, making dinner. It all blurred together, a mechanical routine that masked the turmoil inside. He avoided Jenna as much as possible, burying himself in small tasks to keep from confronting the truth. But avoiding the problem didn't make it go away. On a Friday evening, Jenna came home late again. She walked into the living room to find Eric sitting on the couch, staring at a blank TV screen. For a moment, she hesitated, the tension in the room palpable. We need to talk, Eric said, his voice steady but hollow. Jenna sighed, setting her purse on the counter. Eric, I'm really tired. Stop. Eric's voice cut through the air, sharper than he intended. Just stop lying to me. Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her surprise with a defensive glare. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, Eric said, standing up. I followed you, Jenna. I saw you with him. The color drained from her face. For the first time, she couldn't hide behind excuses or playful deflections. She looked at him, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But nothing came. Eric's chest tightened. How long has this been going on? He asked, his voice breaking. How long have you been lying to me? Jenna sank into a chair, her hands trembling. It's not what you think, she said weakly. But even she didn't sound convinced. Then tell me what it is, Eric demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been cheating on me. There was a long silence before Jenna finally spoke. It's been a few months, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen. Eric let out a bitter laugh. You didn't mean for it to happen? That's your excuse. You accidentally started sneaking around behind my back. I wasn't happy, Eric, Jenna snapped, her voice rising. I felt invisible, like I was just a part of the furniture in your life. You spend all your time at work or with Sophie and I... You could have talked to me, Eric interrupted. You could have told me how you felt instead of running off with someone else. I tried, Jenna said, her voice breaking. But you never listened. You were always too busy, too focused on everything else. Eric shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. Do you even love me anymore? Jenna looked away, her silence answering the question better than words ever could. That night, Eric slept on the couch. Or rather, he tried to. The hours ticked by as he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. How had they gotten to this point? Could their marriage be saved? Or was it too late? By the time morning came, Eric had made up his mind. He couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. The following week, Eric met with a lawyer. The decision to file for divorce felt like both a relief and a defeat, a necessary step to move forward, but one that came with its own set of challenges. Sophie, for one. How was he supposed to tell their 6-year-old daughter that her family was falling apart? Eric decided to wait until he had a plan in place. For now, he focused on keeping things as normal as possible for Sophie. They went to the park, played board games, and worked on her school projects together. She didn't seem to notice the growing distance between her parents, but Eric knew it was only a matter of time. Meanwhile, Jenna seemed to be in denial about the situation. She continued her daily routine, as if nothing had changed, but Eric could see the cracks in her facade. She tried to make small talk, even cooked dinner a few times, a gesture Eric saw as too little, too late. One evening, Jenna sat down across from Eric at the dining table. We can fix this, she said quietly. For Sophie. Eric stared at her, his expression unreadable. We can't fix this, Jenna. You broke something that can't be put back together. But I love you, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. I made a mistake, but I still love you. Eric's jaw tightened. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Love isn't just words, Jenna. It's actions. Jenna reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Eric, please, I don't want to lose you. You already did, he said, standing up. You just don't want to admit it. As the weeks went on, the tension in the house became unbearable. Eric and Jenna barely spoke, communicating only when necessary. Sophie began to notice the change, asking questions that Eric struggled to answer. Why doesn't Mommy eat dinner with us anymore? She asked one night. Eric forced a smile. Mommy's busy, sweetheart. She's working on some things. Sophie frowned but didn't press further. She was a smart kid, too smart for her own good sometimes, but Eric hoped to shield her from the worst of it. Meanwhile, Eric threw himself into work, taking on extra projects to keep his mind occupied. He also leaned on his friend Mark, who became his sounding board during late-night phone calls. "Do you think I made the right decision?" Eric asked one night, his voice heavy with doubt. "Absolutely," Mark said without hesitation. "You deserve better than someone who doesn't respect you." "But what about Sophie?" Eric sighed. "I don't want her to grow up in a broken home." "She won't," Mark assured him. "She'll grow up with a dad who loves her enough to do what's best for both of you. That's not a broken home. It's a healthy one." Mark's words gave Eric some comfort, but the road ahead still felt daunting. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. One Saturday morning, Eric decided to take Sophie to the zoo. It was a sunny day, and he wanted to give her a break from the tension at home. They spent hours wandering through the exhibits, Sophie's laughter filling the air as she marveled at the animals. For a moment, Eric felt a sense of peace. This was what mattered. These moments with Sophie, where everything else faded away. As they sat on a bench eating ice cream, Sophie looked up at him with a smile. "I love you, Daddy," she said. Eric's heart swelled. "I love you too, sweetheart, always." When they got home that afternoon, Jenna was waiting for them in the living room. Her eyes were red, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. Eric sighed, setting his keys on the counter. "Not now. Sophie just had a great day, and I'm not going to ruin it." "This can't wait," she insisted, standing up. "I know I messed up, but I want to make things right." Eric stared at her, his jaw tightening. "You can't undo what you did, and honestly, I'm not sure I even want to try." Jenna's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Eric saw genuine remorse in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said softly. "Just tell me what to do." Eric shook his head. "It's not that simple. Jenna trust doesn't just come back because you want it to." Sophie ran into the room, oblivious to the tension. "Daddy, can we watch a movie?" Eric smiled at her, grateful for the distraction. "Of course, sweetheart. Go pick one out." As Sophie ran off, Jenna wiped her eyes and turned to leave the room. Eric watched her go, feeling a pang of sadness, but also a sense of resolve. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Jenna's mistakes define his life. If you're still watching, thank you for sticking with me through this story. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a similar situation? How did you handle it? And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more. Jenna's desperation to mend their marriage only seemed to widen the divide between her and Eric. Every attempt she made, cooking his favorite meals, suggesting they go to therapy, even leaving small notes apologizing, was met with cold indifference. For Eric, it was too little, too late. But Sophie was starting to notice. "Daddy, why don't you and Mommy hug anymore?" Sophie asked one evening while they were doing a puzzle together. Her small voice carried a weight that pierced through Eric's carefully constructed armor. Eric hesitated, his throat tightening. "Sometimes grown-ups need space to figure things out," he said gently. "But we both love you very much." Sophie tilted her head, unconvinced. "Mommy says you're mad at her. Are you mad at me too?" Eric's heart broke. He pulled Sophie into his arms, holding her close. "Never," he whispered. "I could never be mad at you." The weight of Sophie's innocence only added to Eric's internal conflict. He wanted to protect her from the truth, but he knew it wouldn't be possible forever. The tension in the house was suffocating, and something had to give. The breaking point came during a rare family dinner. Jenna had cooked spaghetti, one of Sophie's favorites, and was trying to keep the conversation light. "How was school today, Sophie?" Jenna asked with forced cheerfulness. "It was good," Sophie replied, twirling pasta around her fork. "We're learning about animals." "That's great, sweetie," Jenna said, glancing at Eric. "Maybe we could go to the zoo again this weekend." Eric didn't look up from his plate. "I have plans," he said flatly. Jenna's smile faltered. "Maybe we could all go together. You can change your plans." Eric finally looked at her, his eyes cold. "Not everything can be changed to fit your schedule, Jenna." The tension was palpable, and Sophie looked between her parents nervously. "Can we just eat?" she asked softly. Eric sighed, setting down his fork. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I didn't mean to ruin dinner." But the damage was done. Jenna stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not doing this anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm trying, Eric. I'm trying to fix this, and you're not even meeting me halfway." Eric stood as well, his voice low and controlled. "You don't get to play the victim here, Jenna. You made this mess." "Fine," Jenna snapped, grabbing her purse. "You win." And just like that, she stormed out of the house, leaving Eric and Sophie alone. Sophie didn't say a word, but her eyes brimmed with tears as she stared at the uneaten spaghetti on her plate. That night, Jenna didn't come home. Eric stayed up, pacing the living room, his mind racing. He wanted to call her, to demand answers, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he focused on Sophie, who had fallen asleep clutching her favorite stuffed animal. He tucked her in and kissed her forehead, silently vowing to shield her from whatever storm was brewing. The next morning, Jenna returned. Her makeup was smudged, and her clothes were wrinkled. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Eric met her at the door, his arms crossed. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone icy. Jenna didn't answer right away. She set her purse down and ran a hand through her hair. "I stayed at a friend's house." "Which friend?" Eric pressed. Jenna glared at him. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Eric laughed bitterly. "No, you don't. But don't expect me to believe a word you say anymore." Jenna walked past him, heading upstairs without another word. Eric watched her go, his jaw clenched. The last remnants of trust between them had been shattered. A week later, Eric decided it was time to tell Sophie about the divorce. He hated the idea of breaking her heart, but he knew it would be worse to keep her in the dark. He sat her down in the living room, taking her small hands in his. "Sophie, I need to talk to you about something important," he began. His voice steady but soft. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "What is it, Daddy?" "Mommy and we've decided we're not going to live together anymore," Eric said carefully. "It's not because of you, sweetheart. We both love you so much, but sometimes grown-ups need to make big changes." Sophie's face fell, and tears welled up in her eyes. "But why don't you love each other?" Eric's throat tightened. "We do, in our own way. But sometimes, love isn't enough to make things work." Sophie threw her arms around him, sobbing into his chest. "I don't want you to go, Daddy." Eric held her close, his own tears threatening to spill. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. I'll always be here for you." As the weeks passed, the divorce proceedings moved forward. Eric and Jenna agreed on joint custody of Sophie, though the tension between them made every interaction unbearable. Eric spent his nights poring over legal documents, trying to ensure Sophie's future would remain as stable as possible. One evening, as Eric was going through paperwork, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. "You okay? Haven't heard from you in a while." Eric stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Finally, he typed back, "Getting through it, barely." Mark's reply came almost instantly. "Let's grab a drink this weekend. You need it." Eric agreed, though he wasn't sure if a night out would solve anything. Still, it felt good to know someone was in his corner. When the weekend came, Eric met Mark at a local bar. The dim lighting and hum of conversation provided a welcome distraction from the chaos of his life. As they sipped their beers, Mark leaned forward. "Have you thought about what's next?" he asked. Eric frowned. "Next?" "Yeah, after the divorce. Are you going to start dating again?" Eric laughed bitterly. "Dating Mark. I can barely keep it together for Sophie. The last thing I need is more complications." Mark shrugged. "Fair enough. But you deserve to be happy, man. Don't let Jenna's mistakes ruin your future." Eric nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The idea of moving on felt impossible, like trying to rebuild a house from ashes. Back at home, Jenna's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would swing between attempts to reconcile and outright hostility, making it clear she wasn't ready to accept the reality of their situation. One night, she confronted Eric in the kitchen. "Why are you so eager to throw this all away?" she demanded. Eric set down the dish he was washing, turning to face her. "I'm not the one who threw it away, Jenna. You did that the moment you chose someone else." Jenna's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," Eric said, his voice firm. "And now, we have to live with the consequences." Jenna's outbursts and Eric's cold resolve reached a boiling point on a crisp autumn evening. Sophie had gone to bed early after a long day at school, and the house was unusually quiet. Eric was in the living room, reviewing documents for the divorce proceedings, when Jenna stormed in, her face flushed with frustration. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "Living like strangers, avoiding each other, tiptoeing around Sophie. This isn't a life, Eric." Eric looked up, his expression unreadable. "It's the life you chose, Jenna." Her jaw tightened. "I made a mistake, okay? A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But I'm still here trying to fix it. Why won't you let me?" Eric set the papers aside, standing to face her. "Because you're not trying to fix it for us. You're trying to fix it for yourself, to ease your guilt." Jenna flinched as if his words were a physical blow. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Eric countered. "You didn't think about me or Sophie when you were sneaking around. You didn't think about what this would do to us. So don't stand there and pretend this is about anything but you trying to make yourself feel better." The room fell silent, the weight of Eric's words hanging in the air. Jenna's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. "I miss us," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. "I miss the way things used to be." Eric's expression softened, but only slightly. "I miss that too, but that life is gone, Jenna. You destroyed it." Jenna sat down on the edge of the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe you can't," Eric said, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe the best thing we can do is let go." As the divorce proceedings continued, Eric began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The weight of Jenna's betrayal still lingered, but he was starting to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He threw himself into his work, picking up extra projects and earning the respect of his colleagues. Sophie remained his top priority, and their bond grew even stronger as they navigated this new chapter together. But Jenna wasn't ready to let go. Despite their countless arguments and the mounting evidence that their marriage was beyond saving, she clung to the hope that Eric might change his mind. She started showing up at his workplace unannounced, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and promises to do better. One evening, Eric returned home to find Jenna sitting on the front steps. She looked tired, her eyes puffy from crying. "Jenna, what are you doing here?" he asked, exasperation creeping into his voice. "I need to talk to you," she said, standing up. "Please, Eric, just hear me out." Eric sighed, unlocking the door and stepping inside. "You've got 5 minutes." Jenna followed him inside, her hands trembling. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she began, but I can't stop thinking about what we had. About the life we built together. I don't want to lose that. Eric turned to face her, his expression hardened. You already lost it, Jenna. The moment you decided to betray me. Her eyes filled with tears, but she pressed on. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just give me a chance. Eric shook his head. It's not that simple. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild overnight, and honestly, I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again. Jenna's face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch. I don't know how to move on without you. Eric's voice softened, but his resolve remained firm. You'll figure it out, Jenna. You're stronger than you think. The turning point came during a custody hearing. Jenna had insisted on full custody of Sophie, arguing that Eric's work schedule made him unfit to care for their daughter full-time. The claim blindsided Eric, who had always put Sophie first, even at the expense of his own well-being. In court, Eric's lawyer presented a compelling case, highlighting Eric's active involvement in Sophie's life and his unwavering dedication to her happiness. Friends and colleagues testified on his behalf, painting a picture of a devoted father who would move mountains for his child. When it was Jenna's turn to speak, she struggled to maintain her composure. Her claims about Eric's unfitness fell apart under cross-examination, and it became clear that her bid for full custody was driven more by spite than genuine concern for Sophie's welfare. The judge ultimately ruled in Eric's favor, granting him primary custody, with Jenna receiving visitation rights. It was a bittersweet victory for Eric, who had hoped to avoid such a public and painful battle. As they left the courtroom, Jenna approached Eric, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. You won, she said bitterly. Are you happy now? Eric looked at her, his expression weary. This was never about winning, Jenna. It was about doing what's best for Sophie. With the custody battle behind him, Eric focused on creating a stable and loving home for Sophie. He redecorated her room, filling it with bright colors and her favorite cartoon characters. They spent weekends exploring parks, visiting museums, and cooking together in their small but cozy kitchen. Despite the challenges, Eric began to feel a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just surviving, he was starting to thrive. But just as he began to find his footing, Jenna threw another curveball his way. One evening, as Eric was helping Sophie with her homework, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. We need to talk, it's important. Eric debated ignoring the message, but ultimately decided to hear her out. He didn't want to leave anything unresolved, especially if it could impact Sophie. When Jenna arrived, she seemed more composed than he'd seen her in weeks. She sat down across from him at the dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I've been thinking a lot, she began, about everything about us. Eric raised an eyebrow. And? I know I've made mistakes, she said. But I've also realized that I need to take responsibility for my own happiness. I can't keep chasing something that isn't there anymore. Eric leaned back in his chair, studying her. What are you saying? Jenna took a deep breath. I'm saying I'm ready to let go for real this time. The words hit Eric like a wave. For so long, Jenna had been fighting to hold on to something that was already broken. Hearing her finally accept the reality of their situation was both a relief and a bittersweet moment. I think that's the right decision, Eric said after a long pause. For both of us. Jenna nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. Maybe someday we can be friends for Sophie's sake. Maybe, Eric said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. As Jenna left that night, Eric felt a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. The chapter of his life with Jenna was finally coming to an end. And while it wasn't the ending he had hoped for, it was the one that allowed him to move forward. The weeks following Jenna's admission felt like stepping into uncharted territory for Eric. With the divorce finalized and a custody agreement in place, he focused on building a new rhythm for his life with Sophie. Their bond was stronger than ever, but the shadows of the past still lingered, refusing to fully dissipate. One Saturday afternoon, as Eric was reorganizing the garage, Sophie appeared at the doorway clutching a folded piece of paper. "Daddy, I made this for you," she said, holding it out shyly. Eric wiped his hands on a rag and took the paper. It was a crayon drawing of the two of them standing in front of their house, holding hands. In the sky above them, Sophie had written, "My dad is my hero." His throat tightened as he knelt to hug her. "Thank you, sweetheart. This is the best gift I've ever gotten." Sophie beamed, but her next words caught him off guard. "Do you think Mommy's sad she doesn't live with us anymore?" Eric hesitated, searching for the right response. "I think Mommy's trying to figure out what makes her happy, and that's okay. We all have to do that sometimes." Sophie nodded, as if she understood more than a 6-year-old should. "I hope she figures it out soon." While Eric was settling into his new life, Jenna seemed to be spiraling. She'd moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, and though she tried to maintain a brave face during her visits with Sophie, Eric could see the cracks in her facade. One evening, Jenna showed up unannounced, looking disheveled and anxious. Eric was immediately on edge. Unplanned visits from her were never a good sign. "I need to talk to you," she said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. Eric closed the door, crossing his arms. "What is it?" Jenna paced the living room, wringing her hands. "I made a mistake," she blurted. "Another one." Eric sighed, already exhausted by the conversation. "What now, Jenna?" "It's about him," she said, her voice trembling. The guy I was seeing. He's been calling me, showing up at my apartment. He won't leave me alone." Eric's jaw tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't know what to do," Jenna said, her eyes pleading. "You were always the strong one, Eric. I need your help." Eric stared at her, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him wanted to slam the door on her problems, to tell her she was on her own. But another part, the part that remembered the woman he'd fallen in love with, felt a pang of guilt. "I'll talk to him," Eric said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Jenna's relief was palpable. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to turn to." The confrontation happened 2 days later. Eric had arranged to meet the man, Derek, at a coffee shop downtown. He'd never seen the guy up close before, and the sight of him stirred an unexpected wave of anger. Derek was everything Eric wasn't. Flashy, overconfident, an oozing charm that felt more like a performance than genuine charisma. "You're Eric, right?" Derek said, sliding into the seat across from him. Eric nodded, his expression neutral. "I'll get straight to the point. Leave Jenna alone. She doesn't want to see you anymore." Derek smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Is that what she told you, funny? She didn't seem so sure when I saw her last." Eric's fists clenched under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Look, I don't care what you think she said she's done with you. Move on." Derek's smirk faltered, replaced by a glint of irritation. "And if I don't?" Eric leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Then we'll have a problem. And trust me, you don't want that." There was a tense silence before Derek finally shrugged, a mocking grin returning to his face. "Fine. I've got better things to do anyway." Eric didn't trust his words, but he knew he'd done all he could. As he left the coffee shop, he felt a mix of relief and frustration. He didn't want to be pulled into Jenna's mess anymore, but he couldn't entirely turn his back on her either. Not when Sophie was caught in the middle. The incident with Derek marked a turning point for Eric. He realized he couldn't keep letting Jenna's chaos seep into the life he was trying to rebuild. He needed boundaries, for his sake and Sophie's. When Jenna came to pick up Sophie for her weekend visit, Eric met her at the door. "We need to set some ground rules," he said. Jenna frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Rules?" "Yes," Eric said firmly. "No more unannounced visits. No more dragging me into your personal problems. I'm here for Sophie, and that's it." Jenna looked hurt, but she didn't argue. "Fine," she said quietly. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," Eric said. "It's about what's healthy for all of us." Jenna nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. "I'll try." With those boundaries in place, Eric began to feel a sense of control over his life again. He started going to the gym, reconnecting with old friends, and even considering the possibility of dating. It wasn't easy, but each small step felt like progress. Sophie continued to thrive, her resilience a constant source of inspiration for Eric. She made new friends, excelled in school, and seemed to adapt well to the changes in their family dynamic. Her happiness was a reminder to Eric that he was doing something right. One evening, while they were watching a movie together, Sophie turned to Eric with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think you'll ever get married again, Daddy?" The question caught Eric off guard. He paused the movie and looked at her. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe someday if I meet the right person." Sophie nodded, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I think you should. You deserve someone who makes you happy." Eric smiled, his heart swelling with love for his daughter. "You make me happy, Sophie, more than anything." But just as Eric began to feel like he was turning a corner, life threw him one final curveball. One evening, as he was preparing dinner, he received a call from Jenna. Her voice was frantic, and he could barely make out her words. "Eric, it's Sophie," she said, her tone panicked. "She fell at the park. We're on our way to the hospital." Eric's heart stopped. He grabbed his keys and drove to the hospital as fast as he could, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When he arrived, he found Jenna pacing the waiting room, tears streaming down her face. "What happened?" Eric demanded. "She tripped and hit her head," Jenna said, her voice trembling. "The doctors are with her now." Eric felt a wave of anger and fear. "How could you let this happen?" "I didn't mean to," Jenna cried. "It was an accident." Before Eric could respond, a doctor entered the room. "Are you Sophie's parents?" he asked. They both nodded, rushing to his side. "She's going to be fine," the doctor said. "It was a mild concussion, but we want to keep her overnight for observation." Relief washed over Eric, and he sagged against the wall. "Can we see her?" "Of course," the doctor said, leading them to Sophie's room. When they entered, Sophie was lying in bed, her eyes half closed but alert. "Hi, Daddy," she said weakly. Eric sat beside her, taking her hand. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "Sleepy," she murmured. Eric kissed her forehead, his heart aching with gratitude that she was okay. Jenna stood on the other side of the bed, tears silently streaming down her face. In that moment, as they both watched over their daughter, Eric felt a flicker of understanding. They would never be the family they once were, but they could still be a team when it mattered most. As Eric sat by Sophie's hospital bed, he couldn't shake the heavy mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief that Sophie was okay, anger at the accident, and an unexpected, almost foreign sense of unity as Jenna stood on the other side of the bed, her gaze fixed on their daughter. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But for the first time in months, Eric felt the possibility of something resembling peace. The next morning, Sophie was discharged with instructions to take it easy for a few days. Eric took her home, carrying her upstairs and tucking her into bed with her favorite stuffed animals. She was cheerful, insisting she felt fine, but Eric wasn't taking any chances. Jenna lingered downstairs, unsure if she should stay or go. When Eric came back down, she hesitated, wringing her hands. "Eric, I wanted to thank you for being there." He looked at her, exhaustion etched across his face. "You don't need to thank me. She's our daughter. I'll always be there for her." Jenna nodded, but her expression was conflicted. "I know I've made things harder for you. I know I've made mistakes." Eric sighed, sitting down on the couch. "Jenna, we've been through this. I don't want to keep rehashing everything right now. All that matters is Sophie." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I just want you to know I'm trying. I'm really trying." For a moment, Eric felt a pang of sympathy. He knew she was struggling, but it didn't change the past. It didn't change what had been broken. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Jenna. But you need to focus on yourself, on being the best version of you for Sophie. That's what she needs from both of us." Jenna nodded, wiping her eyes. "You're right. I'll let you know if you need anything." Eric watched her leave, his emotions a tangled mess. He wanted to move on, but some wounds healed slower than others. The days that followed were quiet, but tense. Sophie's recovery was smooth, and she quickly returned to her usual energetic self. But the accident had left a mark on Eric, a reminder of how fragile their new normal could be. One evening, Eric got a call from his boss. A major project was coming up, one that could fast-track him for a promotion. The catch. It required long hours and occasional travel. Eric weighed the decision carefully. The promotion would mean a better life for Sophie, more stability, and a sense of achievement he hadn't felt in years. But it also meant less time at home, less time with the one person who mattered most. He sat Sophie down to explain. "Sweetheart, Daddy might have to work a little more for a while. It's a big opportunity, and it could help us a lot." Sophie frowned, her little face scrunching in thought. "Will you still have time to play with me?" Eric smiled, pulling her into his lap. "Of course I will. You're my #1 priority." She nodded, satisfied for now. But Eric couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at him. He'd have to make it work, no matter what. The project began, and true to his word, Eric made every effort to balance work and home life. He woke up early to make Sophie breakfast, called her between meetings, and kept their bedtime story routine sacred. It was exhausting, but Sophie's smile made it worth every sleepless night. Jenna, meanwhile, seemed to be making strides of her own. She enrolled in therapy and started attending parenting workshops. She was more present during her visits with Sophie, and her chaotic energy seemed to settle into something calmer, more focused. But just as things seemed to be leveling out, another curveball hit. One evening, as Eric was finishing dinner, his phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "You're not going to believe this, call me ASAP." Eric frowned, dialing his friend. "What's up?" Mark's voice was tense. "It's Jenna. She's been seeing that guy again, Derek." Eric's stomach dropped. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Mark said. "I saw them downtown earlier. They didn't look like they were just catching up." Eric's grip on the phone tightened. After everything, after the custody battle, the therapy, the promises, she was back to the person who had caused so much pain. When Jenna came to pick Sophie up for her next visit, Eric didn't hold back. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Jenna blinked, taken aback. "Is what true?" "Derek, are you seeing him again?" Her face flushed and she looked away. "It's not what you think." "Don't," Eric snapped. "Don't lie to me, I deserve at least that much." Jenna took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. "We ran into each other. He said he'd changed, that he wanted to make things right." "And you believed him?" Eric's voice was incredulous. After everything he's done. After everything you've done. I don't owe you an explanation, Eric, Jenna shot back, her tone defensive. I'm allowed to make my own choices. Not when those choices affect Sophie, Eric said coldly. I won't let him anywhere near her. Jenna opened her mouth to argue, but seemed to think better of it. Fine, he won't come around her. Eric didn't trust her words, but he knew pushing further would only escalate things. For Sophie's sake, I hope you mean that. The confrontation with Jenna left Eric feeling more resolved than ever to protect the life he was building for himself and Sophie. He couldn't control Jenna's actions, but he could control how he responded to them, and he refused to let her decisions derail their progress. In the weeks that followed, Eric threw himself even deeper into his work, using the project as a distraction. The late nights and long hours began to take a toll, but the results were undeniable. His boss was impressed, and the promotion seemed all but guaranteed. One evening, after putting Sophie to bed, Eric sat down at his desk, staring at the stacks of papers and blueprints in front of him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not just for his career, but for his life. A life where he and Sophie could thrive, where the scars of the past wouldn't define them. As he leaned back in his chair, he heard a small voice behind him. Daddy. He turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, clutching her stuffed bunny. What is it, sweetheart? She shuffled over to him, climbing into his lap. I just wanted to say I love you. Eric's heart swelled as he hugged her tightly. I love you too, Sophie, always. The weeks that followed felt like the calm after a long and brutal storm. Eric had finally found a balance in his life, a rhythm that worked for him and Sophie. The promotion at work came through, solidifying his sense of accomplishment. But the real win was at home, where he and Sophie had created a stable and loving environment. Jenna, meanwhile, had faded into the background. Her visits with Sophie continued, but they were more structured, less chaotic. She kept her promise to keep Derek out of Sophie's life, and Eric noticed she was making a genuine effort to be more present for their daughter. While their relationship remained strained, there was an unspoken truce between them. They were no longer at war. They were simply two people doing their best for their child. One Saturday afternoon, Eric and Sophie were at the park, enjoying the crisp autumn air. Sophie was playing on the swings, her laughter echoing through the trees, while Eric sat on a bench, sipping a coffee. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. As he watched Sophie, a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. Eric. He turned to see a woman standing a few feet away. It took him a moment to place her. Melissa, one of the parents from Sophie's school. They'd exchanged polite hellos at school events, but had never really talked. Melissa, Eric said, standing up. Hi. She smiled warmly, holding a cup of her own. I almost didn't recognize you without a stack of blueprints in your hands. How's the project going? Eric chuckled. Busy but good. How about you? I'm managing, Melissa said, glancing at her son, who was chasing Sophie across the playground. It's not always easy being a single parent, but we make it work. Eric nodded, feeling a pang of recognition. Yeah, it's a balancing act. They talked for a while, sharing stories about their kids, work, and the challenges of parenting solo. It was easy, natural, a reminder that connections didn't have to be complicated. As Melissa waved goodbye and headed back to her car, Eric couldn't help but feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. That evening, as Eric tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at him with her big, curious eyes. Daddy, are you happy? The question caught him off guard. Why do you ask that? Sophie shrugged, playing with the edge of her blanket. You smile more now, I like it. Eric felt a lump in his throat. I am happy, sweetheart, because I have you. Sophie grinned, satisfied with his answer. Good, you deserve to be happy." As Eric kissed her goodnight and turned off the light, her words lingered in his mind. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to let himself be happy again. In the following months, life continued to improve. Eric and Melissa started seeing more of each other, their casual conversations at the park evolving into coffee dates and long walks. She was kind, understanding, and, most importantly, good with Sophie. While Eric took things slow, he couldn't deny the spark between them. Jenna, to her credit, seemed to accept the new chapter in Eric's life. During one of her visits with Sophie, she pulled Eric aside. "I'm glad you're moving on," she said, her tone sincere. "You deserve to be happy." Eric was surprised by her words but nodded. "Thank you, I hope you find happiness too." Jenna smiled faintly, as if letting go of a weight she'd been carrying. "I'm working on it." The story came full circle one evening when Eric, Sophie, and Melissa were at a neighborhood holiday party. The house was filled with laughter, the smell of cookies baking, and the soft hum of holiday music. Sophie was running around with the other kids, her cheeks flushed with excitement, while Eric and Melissa chatted by the fire. As he watched Sophie, Eric felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way he'd planned, but in many ways, it was better he'd learned to let go of the pain, to embrace change, and to focus on what truly mattered. When Sophie ran up to him, dragging him toward the group of kids decorating cookies, he laughed, and followed without hesitation. Melissa joined them, her laughter blending with Sophie's as they all worked together to create the most lopsided gingerbread house Eric had ever seen. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eric wasn't looking back. He wasn't consumed by regret or anger. He was present, fully engaged in the moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most. As the night wound down and Eric tucked Sophie into bed, she hugged him tightly. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, sweetheart," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Always." Sitting by her bedside, watching her drift off to sleep, Eric realized something important. The broken pieces of his life hadn't been put back together. They'd been rearranged into something new, something stronger. And that was okay. Thank you for sticking with me through this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me keep bringing you more stories like this one. See you in the next video.